I'd like to welcome everyone watching us via our Zoom link or our X, our Twitter feed for South 24. Really want to thank everyone today for joining us once again. Special thanks. I want to start by thanking Ayad and the entire team at South 24 for collaborating with us at the American Center for South Yemen Studies on this excellent panel today. We have three amazing speakers, very well known to everyone that follows Yemeni affairs. It's really excited to put together one more panel in order to keep that conversation going, keep it up, keep it going, and definitely bringing three experts that can provide us with three different perspectives. I'm sure it is very well appreciated by our audience across the world, not just the US, but Europe, the Asia, and obviously the Arab world. It is very important for us at the American Center to bring these type of programs to a general audience in English in order to be more accessible. But please, for those of you watching, tell your friends this event is being provided to everyone with Arabic translation, simultaneous translation. All you have to do if you're on Zoom, this is not accessible via Twitter or X, but if you're on Zoom, refer them to Zoom, and at the bottom bar of your screen, you're going to see a little icon that says interpretation. Please click on that, and it will allow you to switch between Arabic and English. Today, we are joined once again by a great team, a great panel today that Ayad and I really felt was very important to put together and bring them to speak on Yemeni affairs. Without any specific order, I'd like to welcome our guest, Dr. Thomas Juneau from the University of Ottawa, Sana Center as well, Adrian Calamel from the Washington Outsider Center for Information Warfare, and Ari Heistein from the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Once again, thanks to the South 24 team for providing us the platform and the translation, and it's been really great working with Ayad, Ahmed, Yaqub, Farida. Thank you so much to everyone. To begin officially, and I'd also like to thank our translators today. Hopefully I don't destroy their names. I apologize, ladies. But our translators today are Karin Al-Khoury and Pascal Madauer. So thank you very much to them for their assistance today. Please share the video. Please feel free to help us get the voice out. As everybody knows, Thomas, Ari, Adrian have very great understanding of the region as a whole, but specifically about Yemen, North and South. The ACSYS, the American Center, and South 24, as you can imagine, we're very focused on southern Yemen, on the 8 liberated provinces under the legitimate government. These are the areas where, even though we keep pushing the whole liberated narrative, they are engulfed by conflict themselves, whether it's a threat from the Houthis or internal politics and rivalries. And so today we're going to try to bring our audience a combination of a very outsider's perspective, a broad perspective of the conflict, but as well try to focus on some of those politics, of those internal politics that are either driving the conflict itself or are definitely obstructing the peace process. So thank you very much to everyone. And if you all don't mind, we can get started with some questions. First, I'll pick on Thomas a little bit, but Thomas, first question to you is kind of, while we're looking at the South, we do want to know how the international community is approaching this conflict, the role that the international community beyond the region, not just the GCC, not just the Arab monarchy neighboring Yemen, but the UK, the EU, the US, Russia, China as well, how they're approaching this conflict. And for you, Thomas, after a decade, what has been the role played by these actors, by these international powers?
Thank you for that question, and I won't make a comment on the American picking on the Canadian to start the event. I want to be very brief to begin, because I think we want this to be an informal, fireside chat type. So I'll just make two quick high-level points about American policy in Yemen, and then maybe we can break down the multiple angles that you touched on in your question in the next hour or so. And at this point, to me, the question is, what is the Trump administration's objective in Yemen? Is it to deter or contain the Houthis, or is it to defeat them? And if you look at the language that's been used, there's not clarity at that level. If the objective is to defeat the Houthis, then clearly the tools necessary to achieve that objective have not been put in place. Militarily, what's been done, the airstrikes, which have now stopped, were not even enough. The key weakness, if the objective is to defeat the Houthis, is the absence of a viable partner on the ground. It's the absence of a counterweight, a counterforce that can actually defeat the Houthis on the ground, because from the air it's not enough. And the problem here is the internationally recognized government, which remains far too weak to pose a serious military challenge to the Houthis. And as long as the internationally recognized government and other anti-Houthi forces are so divided, so fragmented, there will not be any legitimate prospect of not only defeating the Houthis, but seriously challenging them. That being said, if the objective is not to defeat the Houthis, but to contain them, to try to deter them from continuing their attacks, at least on that scale, within the Red Sea and beyond, if the objective is to try to kind of limit the rise of the Houthis as an expansive, aggressive regional power, then some elements of a deterrence/containment strategy are in place, but not enough. It is noticeable that the Trump administration seriously ramped up the intensity of airstrikes against the Houthis compared to the Biden administration as it started in January 2024. And certainly the Trump airstrikes raised the cost on the Houthis far more than the Biden administration airstrikes did. That being said, was it enough? And here the answer again is no, especially given the absence of a viable partner on the ground, because even here it has a role to play for a containment strategy. The Houthis have a very high tolerance for pain. They are ready to absorb a significant price to achieve what they want to achieve. And it seemed to me that even the higher pace of airstrikes by the US, and then I'll let Ari bring in the Israel angle in a few minutes, but was not enough to deter them, let alone to defeat them. And if anything, the ceasefire that the Trump administration reached with the Houthis about 2 and something weeks ago now confirmed to the Houthis that the Americans were not serious about seriously investing in a deterrence campaign, let alone a campaign to defeat them. So this brings me to kind of the answer to the question: is the strategy to deter and contain the Houthis, or is it to defeat them? In practice, it's neither. Whatever the actual intention is, and I'm not sure what the actual intention is, but the result on the ground is de facto an acceptance of the Houthis. It's de facto a recognition that the Houthis have won the war, which they have in practice, and that the Americans are going to live with them. That may not be the outcome that a lot of people want, but I think that's the reality on the ground. It's an acceptance of the inevitability of the Houthis' dominance, not only in Yemen, but emergence as a regional power. That is, and we can break down the serious consequences that has for regional security, very negative, but also for Yemenis inside Yemen. And I'll finish with just a quick point on what this means for the South. If indeed there is a scenario where the US de facto accepts the dominance of the Houthis in North Yemen, in combination with the continued weakness of the internationally recognized government, and I see no evidence of a serious push by the U.S., which is what would be required to really prop up the internationally recognized government. There is a scenario in the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years where the Houthis consolidate their power in the north with a de facto acceptance of that reality by at least many in the international community, as much as we may not like it, and the internationally recognized government kind of being squeezed in the middle with the Southern Transitional Council and other actors in the South, remembering that the STC does not fully control the South, emerging as the de facto, even if we don't recognize them, power in the South. For now, the position of the U.S. remains that it supports a united Yemen, and that remains rhetorically the position. But in practice, that may not be viable in the future. So, from the STC's perspective, there is an opening here, if indeed that is the reality of an acceptance of the Houthis' consolidation of power in the north, which I don't think can be expanded to the country as a whole. So I'll stop here, not to be any more detailed than that, and happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Thomas. And just take it as friendly fire from the Mexican, not the American one. We're using the Mexican card nowadays. But thank you, Thomas. This brought up a number of questions and everything, but two things very interesting. You just hit one of the things that many of us have been, screaming out loud, and that is the lack of actual Yemen policy by the U.S. administration, whether it's this Republican administration or the previous Democrat administration. There is no coherent, no cohesive policy approach to Yemen. Therefore, everything is just on the go. Second thing is, you point the clear differences between Operation Prosperity Guardian, which, the Biden administration presented as a purely defensive operation, right? We're only hitting targets as they're preparing to launch or once they've launched to eliminate launch pads, et cetera, versus the Trump administration, which from a military standpoint seemed more aggressive and more proactive, more preventive, right? They went after tunnels, they went after bases, and some junior level leadership. And lastly, the third one, I'm bringing these up just in case anybody wants to hit on them or bring up these topics again. Your focus on the U.S. completely tells us that there is actually no European role here. There is actually no British, no European role, because other than providing some support and Prosperity Guardian, I think only the British cooperated in one airstrike or one series of airstrikes during the 7 weeks of the Trump administration, and really just backed off, and we didn't hear any major criticism or anything like that from the Europeans. So thank you very much for that. Adrian, to you, kicking on that, Thomas's points where, the lack, to be silent on something means a lot. So to not mention the Europeans and the Brits and when we come to military operations against the Houthis, who are labeled as terrorists, right? And even the British at the beginning of the year said that they were contemplating listing the Houthis as a terrorist organization, right? So what can you tell us about, since August of last year, let's say, we've seen the shuttle diplomacy by the Europeans every month nearly, right? Every month in Aden, there's all this shuttle diplomacy being implemented, parachute diplomacy, whatever you want to call it. European ambassadors going to Aden for photo ops, and then they leave, and the next month it's meetings in Riyadh with the PLC, the Political Leadership Council. But if we look from August until now, there has been nothing done by the Europeans when it comes to humanitarian assistance or military or diplomacy supporting the UN envoy. And we really haven't seen them act much, basically, from my perspective, since the FSO software crisis. So you tell us, how do you see the role of the European powers, especially the P3, right? The British, how do you see them playing out today?
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being on a panel with such esteemed guests. What what I have to say is that in acute situations like the so far, they did come in. They saw that there was an issue there, that it was going to be oddly, it was going to be a problem in the Red Sea. It didn't have to actually do. It does. You can say it does have to do with Yemen, obviously, but it's not in the interior. It's not inside the country. The EU, from my estimation, and the countries such as the United Kingdom, who were a part of Prosperity Guardian, as you mentioned, and did partake in one of the airstrikes, it's basically been almost like a glorified UN of observe and report. They will come out with statements such as, we advocate for protection of human rights. They voice concerns over the deterioration of security, the economic issues, as well as the humanitarian situation, which you point out. They condemn the Houthis. They condemn the shipments of arms. And the answer is always a renewed momentum in peace efforts. But I don't see that. It doesn't seem like there is a renewed effort towards peace efforts. And quite frankly, how do you make peace with the Houthis, from my perspective, is that they really want the entire country, and that is the objective. And I thought Thomas brought up a very good point that the United States really doesn't have a strategy. If you can tell me what the strategy is, I can tell you if it's working. We don't know if it's containment. If it is containment, I think probably the protective rings around Aden are helpful, but we look at the Houthis. We also have to look at other groups in the area. AQAP is becoming very formidable again, which poses another threat to the STC and the South. So there is that issue. But if you want to take back and you want to liberate, if you want to say, from Houthi-controlled area, that is going to take a lot. And there really isn't. You could say that we could strengthen that relationship with groups inside the Presidential Leadership Council. Especially, I lean towards the STC as the one cohesive group that could possibly do this. But it would be almost like a Southern Alliance type of, AKA Northern Alliance approach to Afghanistan. And I don't see that type of thing happening, where Americans are going to coordinate with the STC on the ground to roll back the Houthis, who have dug in. You have to remember, they took Sana'a in 2014. This isn't an easy operation, and you can't win a war from the air. So where does that leave us? As far as the world, the policy, before all of this, before the Arab Spring, Yemen was the red-headed stepchild. They were always left out of every discussion. It was always a humanitarian disaster. Everybody looked at Iraq, looked at the Islamic Republic of Iran, looked at the crisis in Lebanon, looked at states that were close to failing. But Yemen was just kind of, well, we got Saleh there, and he's got a strong grip and can maintain control of the country. But that fell apart. So I know I've talked around in circles here, but as far as the EU goes, uh, I think they're just kind of in a very reactive mode. And as you said, it doesn't seem as that they've been even present lately. And maybe this is just because of the kinetic action. And I think it's difficult to disassociate the Houthi situation with the actual with the negotiations that are taking place with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Many of us, myself included, viewed the strikes on the Houthis as part of this policy that Trump was trying to impose, that we're going to take kinetic action, economic action, and then we're going to meet you at the with some type of diplomacy and see where that goes. So that's basically what I have to say on that issue. I want to leave some time for other guests to chime in and rebut anything I might have to say. Thank you.
No, definitely, Adrian. You brought up some excellent points. The way that I look at the international community's involvement, right, Europe and the U.S., it's the Stockholm. Let's just say from 2011, right, the creation of the G10, the NDC, the National Dialogue Transition. Then we have the failure of talks in whether Switzerland, etc. We have Stockholm. We have Safar, and now we have the Red Sea crisis. Read kind of we can kind of frame it around those important events. You brought up a point that some of us have pushed out there, and I've talked to a lot of Yemenis about where this operation against the Houthis, this military buildup in Diego Garcia early this year by the U.S. was more of a force projection toward Iran than really toward Yemen itself, even though, from my perspective, I can only imagine how the GCC saw this and really rattled the cages there, because you gentlemen may correct me, but the fact that it's a lack of it's not a priority for the West. The Yemen is not a priority it is a top priority for the GCC monarchies, and for them to see this buildup and this operation. They're the primary targets if something goes wrong, if the Houthis decide to escalate. As we saw yesterday, I believe that Mahdi Mashad made a kind of subtle threat, claiming that U.S. fighter jets were being placed next to civilian aircraft, and therefore there were now legitimate targets, meaning Saudi Arabia and whoever has a U.S. airbase, basically, or providing assistance to the U.S. And so this also brings us, to the point, Ari, where this this conflict it's really from the Houthi perspective. If we look at real data, the impact on the Red Sea, minus 5% actual disruption of maritime commerce. Since April 1st, 2022, Saudis and the Houthis have had a detente where, we're not going to hit you, you're not going to hit us. And so for some of us, that detente, that ceasefire between Saudi, the Emirates, and the Houthis is vital for stability in the peninsula, because they do have to worry about Iran. But now, with the Houthis taking advantage of the war in Gaza and really propping up their profile, right? They've risen through the ranks within the Iran's axis of resistance to a major player. And now, especially because Hamas and Hezbollah really, been downgraded leadership-wise, militarily. For me, my focus has been the Houthis and the Iraqi militia as the two main actors right now. But from an Israeli perspective, the Houthis are capitalizing on the Gaza war to prop up themselves, to become legitimate internationally, to gain support. But Israel's kind of playing along with it, aren't they? They're really, Netanyahu is kind of going along with it, and it's like, oh, you want to claim this? Here we go. And Israel has done excellent force projection, has shown the region their military capability beyond the Levant. How do you see this war of words and yet, armed conflict now between Israel and the Houthis?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. As you pointed out, since the October 7th massacre by Hamas, the Houthis basically just seized upon that moment, and it was quite a convenient moment for them, I would say. Beforehand, they were dealing with some very unusual protests and demonstrations. It's very rare that you see public outcry or any sort of, let's say, opposition to the Houthis from within their territory. And what you had was a teachers' strike, teachers' unions supported by the GPC, or some members of the GPC. And so the Houthis, I think, were in a pretty precarious moment in time when October 7th happened. Since then, I would say that in addition to bolstering their own legitimacy, I think they've tried to assume, as you mentioned, a more prominent role in the axis of resistance, which I think that's kind of been facilitated by the decline of Iran's two of Iran's major partners. Of course, the Assad regime, and then Hezbollah. And I would also say that these attacks on the Red Sea and Israel comport with the general approach or vision of the Houthis of creating regional chaos and disruption. And so what we've seen over time is that their attacks have escalated. First, we saw a few drones or missiles to Eilat, and now, more recently, what we've seen is attacks on Haifa and northern Israel, and they've become more frequent. And some have unfortunately managed to strike Israeli territory. Most recently, in early May, which obviously caused some serious disruptions in Israeli flights. And these actions are essentially carried out by the Iran-backed Houthi movement, and they're carried out with Iranian-supplied weaponry. I would say that Israel has no real strategic interests in Yemen beyond the desire to neutralize the Houthi threat. So I don't think you have a situation where Israel has any sort of vision for what it wants to achieve in Yemen, but I think it's clear that Israel does want to see the Houthi threat eliminated. And so previously, I believe that a myth has sort of evolved about the Houthis, that they are invincible, and that the more that you attack them, the stronger they get. I tend to be quite skeptical of this myth. I think that would essentially be claiming that they defy the laws of gravity. Ultimately, if you're able to hit somebody very hard or hit an actor very hard, it will be painful for them. I think that the failure of the Saudis to do this was because I would say of limited capability of the Saudi military, both to inflict precise strikes on Houthi assets, and also Saudi Arabia's limited ability to absorb the blows that the Houthis were delivering. And for the U.S., obviously the U.S. has incredible amounts of intelligence and military power, but I just think that the Trump administration lost interest in Operation Rough Rider after about 2 months. So just a quick word on how the U.S. lost interest in Operation Rough Rider. I'm someone who believes that actually things were going quite well, but I would say that the Houthis managed to do something extremely successfully. They portrayed that this was going to be an extremely bloody and protracted conflict, and they did that in two ways. First, they hid their losses. I wouldn't be surprised if several years from now we discover that certain senior Houthi leaders were killed. I know that in the past, some senior Houthi leaders that were killed, it was only disclosed maybe a year and a half later. And so that gave the impression that this was not going very well. And then in addition, the Houthis managed to continue firing, and that created also the impression that the military capabilities were not being diminished or degraded at the pace that the Trump administration was hoping. And so I think that part of this was an informational operation, or sort of a war of perception, and that the Houthis, I would say, beat out the U.S. on that front, or managed to create a strong enough impression that unfortunately the U.S. lost interest in this. But I do believe that Israel will be a little bit different than the Saudi and American conflict and U.S. operations, just because I think Israel, number one, has military capabilities that are significant, presumably better at, let's say, conducting precision strikes than the Saudis. And I would also say they can't sort of just decide they're not interested anymore in the same way that the Americans did. And so they're going to need to follow through. And so what I expect is that the Houthis are going to find in Israel a very formidable foe. What I would say, though, is my advice to Israel would be align your strategy with the interests of the Yemeni people, I think right now what we have is an alignment of interests. Both the Israelis and the majority of Yemenis, I believe, would like to see the Houthis out of power and eliminated. I think that if Israel can avoid taking any missteps, they will be dealing with a regime that is both, on the one hand, projecting a lot of power, but at the same time, quite fragile. And I think that if there are a few crises that are created for the Houthis, it's not inconceivable that we could see a situation where there are severe threats posed to the stability of the regime, whether that's fragmentation, whether that's decline. Of course, we have to acknowledge the fact that there's an issue with the government of Yemen, and it seems unlikely that there's going to be a ground invasion by forces under the umbrella of the government of Yemen. My take on that was always, I know that there's a lot of talk going on during Operation Rough Rider, but I thought essentially the minute the first missile flew over the Saudi border, that was going to be the end of any sort of operation. And so I think we may also see changing dynamics between the supporters of the countries that are essentially patrons of of southern Yemen and their forces the forces within Yemen, because at this point, it looks like without any sort of change in that relationship, we may end up seeing these southern Yemeni forces growing weaker over time because, in a sense, they're not being allowed to succeed by the countries that are supporting them.
Absolutely, Ari. Thank you very much, because again, you brought up a number of points that I would like to hit on. Israel, from our perspective, from the Yemeni perspective, and from the GCC, Israel can really play a role of disruptor by escalating against the Houthis. And so put myself in Saudi shoes, Emirati shoes, right? Israel, after the first airstrikes by Israeli Air Force in Hodeidah and Sana'a, Israel threatened, Netanyahu directly threatened the Houthis and said, remember what happened to Hezbollah and Hamas. We can go after and decapitate, basically our operations can be decapitating to the leadership, meaning threatening the Houthi, Beit al-Houthi, the Houthi family, the Houthi leadership, the way that they did to Hamas and Hezbollah, right? Which, correct me if I'm wrong, Thomas, Adrian, but this would be a bit disruptive for Saudi Arabia to, cut the head of the snake, and then this chaos that ensues, right, with junior level Houthi leaders who have access to drones that are deployed, missiles, and there is less deterrence, there is less control over them, and so if you can speak about that in a minute, but give me 1 second with Ari that I do want to talk about. The one thing that you pointed out, how Israel should align with the interests of the Yemeni people. One thing that we've noticed since the Houthi Gaza myth screen initiated is Yemenis as a whole, even though they want to get rid of the Houthis, they have been unable to publicly criticize the Houthis for launching the strikes on Israel or for their propaganda, right? It's been very low level because they don't want, in my opinion, no political party in Yemen, even whether they're supported by Saudi or the Emirates, can afford publicly to support an anti-Israel, can object to an anti-Israel position by the Houthis, right? It is very dangerous for them at any point to allow the Houthis to say, oh, the Southerners, Islah or Mu'tamar, are now aligned with Israel and not the Palestinian people, things like this. So how do you see that dynamic? Why do you think, if there's anything else, that the other political parties, especially in the South, are not coming out strong condemning the Houthis for basically escalating the conflict beyond the region, beyond the country, and bringing more suffering to 20 million Yemenis, right? Because at the end of the day, the ordinary Yemeni in North Yemen and the South is suffering from these airstrikes in Sana'a or Hodeidah.
So I think that something is changing now. I would say that the responses of the officials from the government of Yemen were quite interesting for the most recent strikes on the Yemenia Airlines plane, where it was not condemnation of Israel, but it was condemnation of the Houthis for bringing destruction onto Yemen. And what I think is really happening is that the Yemeni people are becoming more aware that the conflict with Saudi Arabia, which brought, or the Saudi-led coalition, which brought so much destruction onto Yemen, was not a one-off. It was not what like an aberration, but that is going to be the norm for as long as the Houthis are around. And I think this is something that is deeply concerning for them. They're essentially, to my mind, being held hostage. And maybe I'm taking this a step too far, but I think there may be some greater awareness of, let's say analogies or parallels to what Hamas is doing in Gaza, in the sense that the people in northern Yemen are not necessarily guilty for what the Houthis are doing, but they've created a very serious dilemma for those who want to deal with this very aggressive Iran-backed threat. And so I think the feeling of being used as human shields and paying the bill for this, let's say, foreign-backed dangerous terrorist group may create some additional sympathies with Israel. I don't think that there has to necessarily be any sort of open relation, like any sort of open relationship between the two, between Israel and the Yemenis. But I do believe that there is common cause, and it would be a shame to waste that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Good points. Thomas, Adrian, you both mentioned, Operation Rough Rider, the aggressive approach taken by the Houthis, taken by the Trump administration. How do you think because we saw some reports that Saudi was lobbying the Trump administration to, slow down on Rough Rider before the Riyadh visit, that they didn't want the optics of the airstrikes ongoing against the Houthis while Trump was in Riyadh. How do you see, the potential for the U.S. to decapitate, to launch decapitating strikes against the Houthis, go after the leadership, the way that Trump, boasted on Truth Social that, you can't hide, he was very aggressive. How do you see, number one, how do you see this being received in the Gulf? And two, to your points, both of you, when is any Yemeni actor on the ground taking advantage of any momentum, military momentum against the Houthis? When is the point where the Guards of the Republic, Amalek the Giants, the army in Marib, where do they see that momentum that says to them, we need to join and we need to go after the Houthis?
Well, I can start, and then Adrian can jump in. I would say that one of the defining characteristics of dynamics right now involving the regional dimension of the war in Yemen is that the Houthis have de facto established escalation dominance with regards to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Escalation dominance is a function of capabilities, but it's also a function of intentions. And right now, the reality is that for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, their priority is stability, it's stabilization, it's to avoid conflict. The UAE, its brand is premised on but also being perceived as a safe haven for trade, for transit, and so on, for blue collar and white collar workers from not just the West, from pretty much anywhere, being able to go there. Saudi Arabia has shifted towards that direction over the past few years, where it also wants to paint itself and to be perceived as a safe and stable haven for trade and investment and tourism and so on. So now we are in a situation where, thanks to Iranian support, the Houthis have the missiles and drones that can shatter that image. And that is something that Saudi Arabia and the UAE want to avoid at all cost. A drone hitting a nice skyscraper in Dubai, a drone or a missile hitting the F1 race in Saudi Arabia or other high-profile events in Saudi Arabia. They absolutely want to avoid that. And the challenge is that the Houthis absolutely understand that. And so the mere threat of renewing missile and drone attacks on Saudi Arabia and the UAE is enough to severely constrain Saudi and Emirati margin of maneuver and to steer them to pressure the US to avoid scenarios that could lead to escalation and thereby a renewal of strikes on Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So that pretty much is where we're at now in terms of the Saudi and Emirati dimension to these dynamics. So when there were a few weeks ago a lot of rumors, including in the Wall Street Journal and in obviously in local and regional media, rumors of possibilities of a ground effort campaign against the Houthis, as much as I would have wished to see it in a way, I never thought that it was likely because I was 100% convinced that Saudi Arabia and the UAE did not want that ground campaign. And without them, there is no such ground campaign. There's no such serious ground campaign, just to bring in that nuance. But they did not want it because they knew with absolute certainty, and they were correct in that perception, that in the event of a ground campaign, the Houthis would have hit them directly. And they, to go back to my initial point, they do not want that. So going back to my initial remarks from half an hour ago when I was talking about, well, what's the strategy? Is it to defeat? Is it to contain and deter? Or de facto now, is it to accept the inevitability, the reality of Houthi dominance of northern Yemen? I focused on the US in my remarks because I tried to be brief, but that Saudi and Emirati angle very much explains why the objective of defeating the Houthis is simply not a realistic one at this point. Again, whether we like that outcome or not, it's not on the table. And even the deter and contain the Houthis one is still partly achievable, but it's hard, and it is made difficult by that Saudi and Emirati variable.
Right.
And I'll stop there.
Adrian, you had something to share?
Yeah, I was just going to add real quickly that I think it'll be interesting to see what happens at the end of the nuclear negotiations, because I do think they're going to come to a close, and I don't think there's going to be an agreement between the Islamic Republic and the United States. So what will we start to see from the Saudis and their perspective in that way? I believe that there was a tremendous amount of rebalancing once the Saudis saw the writing on the wall once Biden came into office. You also had the 2018 Congress push the Saudis into not being able to perform certain military activities. It will be interesting to see. We also have to remember that when all this has been going on, when Trump is over in meeting with UAE, the Qataris, with the Saudis, we also have to remember that the STC was over here meeting in Washington just the week beforehand. So you wonder if that's an after action assessment, battle assessment, what's going on, what the situation is. But I will say this: as far as hitting high value targets, Ari was exactly right. They will hide these things. Some you cannot hide, but we know with individuals like Mullah Omar in Afghanistan, that guy was dead for years, and they were able to hide that. Israel learned a very valuable lesson when they tried to cut the head off the snake with Moussaoui and Hezbollah, that sometimes the head of the snake, you're going to get a worse replacement, and that was Nasrallah. This time, what they did was they went from the ground up, and they removed complete structures all the way till they got to the head of the snake, and then took the head of the snake off. I don't see that approach in Yemen. So we'll see what happens.
Thank you all three for this. And one of the reasons why, from my perspective, I've asked these questions and I've, appreciate all your comments and everything, is because all of this that all three of you have said has a direct impact on the South, the liberated area, whether we frame it as the impact on the political council or we focus on the Southern Transitional Council, the STC. Why? Because since October 1st, 2022, the Houthis have threatened oil in the south, in Shabwa, Marib, and Hadramaut. And this has deepened the economic crisis because it really cut off all revenue to the political leadership council and created and exacerbated the dependence on Saudi financial aid. And when you do that, when you allow a
Am I the only one who lost Fernando here?
No, I lost him as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's hope that Fernando, can you hear us?
Oh, he dropped right off.
He
But he had
dropped right
mentioned
off.
that Spell 24 was going to ask some questions. I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't know.
Farida, do you want to read questions in the Q&A for us? And we can do that while we wait for Fernando to jump back in.
Hi. Yes, yes, I can read it. There is a question from Ahmed Yahya. Does US and Europe interested about South Yemen as
sorry
country
about that.
independency? Did you
Major
hear the question?
apologies. Sorry,
Fernando,
Farida. Sorry, Farida. Sorry, I'm back. I really apologize for this.
You can
Farida,
continue. You can continue.
thank you so much. Thank you so much. I apologies for that. Major technical issue here. How do you, the three of you, if you can tell me, how this affects the SDC's position in the South? A couple of you already mentioned how this conflict pins the SDC against the wall. The SDC cannot afford popular uprising against them, right? Which we're starting to see some criticism rising because of their failure, quote unquote, to address electricity or the economy. And then are we returning to the rivalries on the ground between the SDC and Islah, SDC and Rashad al-Alimi because of this inability to deal with the basic delivery, the delivery of basic services to over 8 million people across the South? How do you see this developing? And for me, again, if the U.S. is not interested in the South, the Europeans should be, right? So where do the Europeans come when it comes to the SDC and the South?
And maybe
Thomas,
I can make a few points on this issue. First of all, on the Europeans, I would reinforce the point you made on my behalf a few minutes ago, when you presume that I was assuming that they are not a major player at this level, and I would just reinforce that here. My understanding is that the European position remains support for a united Yemen, but and therefore not separation of the South. But as I said in my presentation, in a scenario of de facto consolidation of Houthi power in the north, the issue of the fiction of a united Yemen, we can still punt it down the road, but we can only do that for so long. I think we can still do that for now, but maybe not for forever. I would add a point on the role of the UAE here. As everybody here knows, the UAE has been the main backer of the STC, politically, financially, and in terms of backing southern militias militarily, and in terms of intelligence and so on, and training and capabilities. There's always been a tension here because the UAE supports a separatist player that wants to break Yemen apart. Which is not the objective of Saudi Arabia, and it is not the objective of the US and the EU if we want to bring them in. So there's always been a significant tension here that, again, has been sort of punted down the road because the UAE does not publicly, and publicly, formally recognize or express its preference for an independent southern Yemen. But de facto, that's what they're supporting on the ground. So in the scenario that I was describing of de facto separation between North and South, then the ability to punt that issue of Southern separation down the road becomes more difficult, not just for the US and the EU, but for the UAE too, with all of the tension that can potentially raise with Saudi Arabia, at least as long as Saudi Arabia does not change its position. That being said, and I'll finish on this massive caveat, which is that scenario that I'm describing of the internationally recognized government being squeezed between North and South, between a de facto consolidation of Houthi power in the North and the rest of the country. The problem with that scenario is that in practice, it's not clean at all. It is not a clean scenario because the STC does not control the South as a whole. And by South here, I mean basically what the Houthis don't control. There are significant parts in the south, but especially in the east, where the STC has little or no influence. And not only that, it is not appreciated. There is no desire for the STC's influence to be expanded in some of these eastern areas. So that, to me, is a really important point to emphasize, that when I described that scenario 45 minutes ago now, by doing it in 30 seconds, I was kind of painting it in a way that is way too simple compared to the very messy reality of the multiple actors vying for influence in non-Houthi parts of the country. And that can lead to some pretty concerning sub-scenarios, if you want to call it like that.
Anyone else have a comment on this? Definitely,
Sure.
I have other questions. Go ahead, Ari.
Sure. So if I could just adapt your question a little bit and make it sort of, how does, let's say, Israel's involvement in Yemen impact the South? Then I would say that I think what we've seen recently and what we may see more of is actually a reversal of an ongoing trend that has been going, I would say, for the last basically a decade. The Houthi strategy thus far has basically been to create its own economy, divide its economy from Yemen, and then destroy southern Yemen's economy. Okay? And I think that the Israeli strikes may have an impact on that calculation, in the sense that the fact that a lot of these ports, or certain aspects of these ports, are no longer operable, and certain industries are no longer functional. Let's say like the two cement factories, the one in Hodeidah and the one in Amran. Those are things that it was previously forbidden to import cement from southern Yemen to northern Yemen. I think we may see a reversal of this trend, where the Houthis may try to reintegrate to some degree their economies, and that will make it harder for them to destroy the southern Yemen economy. So this could be sort of interesting twist on what we've seen so far. One potential indicator of this is just a few minutes before we started our call, I saw an indication from a reliable journalist that the Aden to Sana road has just been opened again, the one through Adela, and this is apparently quite a big deal. And so we may see which, to my mind, could be quite good for the southern Yemeni economy, which has thus far basically been battered by the Houthis.
But to jump on that, Ari, and to expand on Thomas's comment, all of this is without disruption or without chaos as well, right? From a southern perspective, and I hear this all the time from southerners, the oil industry is controlled by northerners, right? Well, the companies, the agents for these oil companies, they're from north, because they're from the elite, from the northern elite, from the 33 years of Saleh, and there has been no mechanism to shift or incorporate southern business into this industry, right? When we talk about something like cement, we bring up the Heistein plant in Lahej, right? Heistein being from the north, being from the elite, etc. There is no quote unquote southern replacement in the near future in these sectors, because there has, from our perspective, there's been no investment, or investment hasn't been allowed. There's been no real shift in the economy in the last 10 years. where, I was one since 2016, then 2019, after I left the UN, to push for diversifying from the Hodeidah port, right? If all the aid went to Hodeidah, why can't we take 10, 15% of that traffic and send it to the south, which, I mean, realistically, Aden doesn't have huge capacity, Mukalla doesn't have, but by shifting, you create the need to invest and expand that capacity. So in 10 years, no one has done that. Not the UN, not Saudis, not the Emiratis. No one has worried about that. Does the STC have the capability? Do they have the capacity to generate such attractive investment, manage it, right? And lastly, the catch-22 here for the international community, or someone like the Southerners or Saudis, if we free up commerce going back north from the south, then all the Houthis have to do is tax everybody at the checkpoint, tax everybody at the de facto border, and then that directly funds the Houthis, right? So how do we work through these scenarios and these problematics that eventually keep reinforcing the strengthening of the Houthis? Any of the three of you that want to chime in on this?
Yeah, so just my response to what you had mentioned regarding the Houthi ability to tax. I mean, obviously, the Houthis control almost absolutely most of the people who are living within their territory, and they can basically take whatever they want from anybody at any time. But I do think decentralizing their economy in the sense that mitigating their control of key economic arteries is something that will make their control of the economy much more difficult. And I think that once it's harder for them to control the economy, then you may end up seeing alternate centers of power develop. Up until this point, I think they've done quite a good job of ensuring that any major industries, companies, border crossings, sources of revenue in general have been in very trusted hands. I think that when things start to shift, it may become more complicated for them. And while I understand that there are still a limited number of border crossings on land, I do think that there is a difference between docking a ship and, let's say, trucking things along or bring. I imagine that it's somewhat easier to create an economy, especially in Yemen's porous, let's say, division between the north and the south. That would be harder for the Houthis to control.
Thomas, Adrian, how difficult is it for the STC to attract investments from outside, from the Europeans, whatever sector? I mean, you can't have an sector, you can't have a web-based economy if you can't have electricity for longer than 6 hours a day, right? Mobility, transport between the 8 provinces. Southerners want investment, whether it's by Southerners living abroad, many millionaires living abroad in Europe or the US, they want investment. But how do they create this environment that attracts investment, whether it's micro, macro level? And how does the STC, or how do the Southern entities start generating some economic activity in the South?
That's going to be one of the difficult parts. If you look at the STC support, it is solely come from the UAE. That's where they're getting their support from. Now, we'll have to see if this visit from Trump or Trump getting or the STC coming over to Washington move the scales and all as far as investment goes. But there's been several things that have been pointed to, and that's one of the things that there's arguments within the STC, within the Presidential Leadership Council, and that rip that we're seeing is with ISLA, and we're seeing it with the STC. And as time goes, and we stretch that timeline, and the Houthis are not displaced, there's going to be less and less. They're going to say, what has the STC done except for put protective rings around Aden and allow us to operate for certain periods of time. There needs to be more investment into that area. I think one of the problems with, let's say, strikes, and everybody's so focused on the oil, that's the investment, but Yemen is, for the most part, an oil poor country, and there needs to be investment in other areas. But this has been Yemen's issue for a very, very long time, and unfortunately, a lot of that, the manufacturing capacities or the investment type of opportunities are to the north and not to the south, but that needs to be diverted. And Ari brought up some great points about the disruption with some of these checkpoints and some of the trade routes, the arteries that had kept the Houthi economy going. But how do you get investment back into the south? How do you get into the STC?
Right. Thomas, to pick on you, in 2019, when the SDC declared the self-autonomy, the self-administration, a major issue that they had was taxation, right, which is the primary source of revenue for any government. With all these tensions, everything that's going on in Hadramaut, Mahra, and around Aden, do you foresee the SDC either calling for self-administration once again, or having the ability to implement even a minimal level of control over the economy in the near future?
Well, the huge challenge comes back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, which is that the STC only has partial control of the South. There are significant areas, especially in the East and the Southeast, that it does not control, and where it is, to be blunt, not welcome. And even in those areas where it is more influential, it has a degree of control, in some cases a higher degree of control, but it is not the only actor in the South that exerts influence. And that remains a major obstacle. So if, as long as that is the case, whatever the timeline, the SDC tries to make moves towards greater autonomy, let alone independence, there is a serious risk of backfiring. Because it does not it does not have a monopoly on the use of force, to put it in those terms, even in those areas where it is more influential. So it's very easy to say, but the SDC has to enlarge its coalition, and not only in geographic terms, but in political terms, to bring more Southern actors under a common umbrella. And as long as that is not the case, it will not achieve its objective. And when I was saying at the beginning that there's a potential window now, with the Houthis consolidating and more, the international community de facto not appreciating, but recognizing, sorry, not the right word, but learning to live with the reality of Houthi dominance in the north, that means there's an opening for the South, but that opening to be seized, there's a massive precondition, and it is not met now, and that is build a bigger umbrella.
Right. Right. And in closing, because we're going to come into about an hour of our discussion, in closing, I do want to go back to some of my comments from the intro, and that is, how do the three of you see going back to the South and the relationship with the political leadership? How do the three of you see, the optics or even the potential for the SDC opening an office in DC, right? To engage and to begin lobbying operations. It's the first one in a foreign capital. There's high expectations from among the Southern population, right? Whether it's in South Yemen or here in the US. And also this trip to Moscow by PLC chairman Rashad al-Alimi, right? We've seen Idris Azubaydi, the head of the SDC, he's traveled to Russia, but he's not met with Putin in public, right? This trip with Rashad al-Alimi is a major optics campaign, basically, right? With him meeting Putin in person in Moscow. But then I'll bring it again. Trump was in Riyadh. They could have met for 5 minutes, the way that Obama and Hadi met at the UN way back then. We didn't have that. Trump only mentioned Yemen once, and it was in reference to the Houthis. How do the three of you see this playing out this year? You know, the dynamics that are being played out. Do you think Russia will play a major role? Russia's recruiting Houthis, right? Northerners for Ukraine. We saw an arrest of a Yemeni Houthi in Germany, I believe it was this week, sentenced. How do you see these dynamics of the SDC reaching out more to the U.S. in person, on the ground, and this meeting between Rashad al-Alimi and Putin in Moscow?
And I'll take the part of the question on the STC's diplomatic outreach. I think if the STC really wants independence of the South, or at least some form of stronger autonomy, or whatever its objective is in the long term, it really needs to up its diplomatic game. It really needs to enhance, increase, energize its diplomatic outreach. The STC does it a bit. It has been doing it a bit more year after year. Every now and then I go to events, some of them organized by the Sana Center or others, and there are STC or STC adjacent people who attend. The STC actually has sort of an office here in Ottawa, and I've met them a bit over the years. But if they want that level of recognition, if the SEC wants that level of support, it's not going to be free. It's going to take patient engagement, and that can be measured only in years. There is an opening to paint itself as a partner to the US, secondarily to the EU and to others, in a world where the North is dominated by the Houthis. But that requires a level of commitment and patience that will have to be measured in years. And absolutely, it has to go through Washington, but other capitals too.
Adrian?
Yes, I personally, I think Washington and the Southern Transitional Council need to start working together and getting on the same page. Thomas brings up great points that they need to create a bigger tent, bigger umbrella to bring more people in, to bring in more popularity, and to see that they are an answer. They are an answer to not just the Houthi onslaught, but we also have, Thomas mentioned, to the east, that's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula for the most part. There's been some fights with ISIS that also occupy pockets in those areas. So what I see over the next year is, Trump signed this or made an agreement with the Houthis about maritime travel. And I always said that as soon as maritime travel was affected, then people would start to understand who the Houthis were, or at least know who they were. Nobody talked about them prior to this. Now, he put a stopgap in place. And the other point I want to make is that, if we start to see the Saudis pull back over, we have to remember that before October 7th, 2023, all those projectiles, all the Scud missiles, all the drones, they were being fired at Saudi Arabia, at UAE, at the Abu Dhabi airport, at Conoco or Aramco facilities. So I'm concerned that the Houthis have been using these. They took a little bit of a beating, but my concern is that since about 2018, 2019, they've been struggling with a manpower problem. And they have slowly been increasing that manpower issue and making it better as people come to age, meaning fighting age. And also, you also have the Biden administration removing the foreign terrorist organization list. There's been less interdiction of weapons. You see an increase in drone manufacturing. And my concern is that this will be a final assault on Aden. That's my biggest fear. That's what I worry about. That's what keeps me up at night.
Thank you, Ari. Any comments on this track?
Sure. So I guess the way that it seems now is that the forces in southern Yemen are going to be very powerfully restrained so long as they remain almost entirely dependent on Gulf patrons. And so I do think that expanding their bases of support could ultimately see a more effective anti-Houthi force. I believe that they should be working on this and making a diplomatic blitz in order to try and expand their bases of support, both in terms of funding, arms, and a variety of other different things. But I would question the degree to which there is appetite for supporting these types of organizations. I hope it's greater than I think it is, but I think it may be somewhat limited to if a small number of Western states.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with experts like yourselves. I appreciate South 24's support, their collaboration, their interest in these events. In case you were following on Zoom, we've been broadcasting live through X, through Twitter as well, and we'll be posting this video on YouTube as well for anyone. I'm waiting to see if there's any questions sent to me from online, but I haven't received any, so I apologize. To close this up, again, the framework that I presented earlier, the challenges continue to expand for the Southern people. They are definitely, if Thomas put it that the Southerners are between the PLC and the Houthis, they are between actors on the ground, right? That have been using politics in order to prop themselves, in order to have access outside patronage, as Ari and others have put it. The umbrella from the national dialogue, from the Southern dialogue that was presented by the SDC, was definitely a first step toward that unity, right, Thomas? To try to bring everybody and prevent outside actors from leveraging those divisions. But again, the interest in Mahra are different from Hadramaut, which are different from Aden, right? And how do you reconcile these when you're unable to set a precedent, when you're unable to put forth a project that gains more support for the
Fernando, I'm
South?
sorry.
Yes.
There is a little of questions if you need that. I think it will. I send it on your chat, and you can. Yeah.
Okay, give me a second then, gentlemen, if I can take a few more minutes. Give me a couple of seconds. I'm picking. I'm just gonna read,
Or
and
on
I
the tool,
apologize.
ask
Yeah, I'm
and
gonna read.
question.
Yeah, I'm gonna read what you just texted. So, given the current fragmentation of the recognized government, continued instability appears inevitable. What steps should the SDC take in response? Should the SDC choose to withdraw from the government? This is interesting, right, Thomas? I mean, when the SDC joined the PLC, it gained legitimacy, right, with the Riyadh agreement in 2019. Is there a point where the SDC says enough is enough? We try this, it's not going to work, and they go at it alone? Is there a point for that?
Yes, there is a point for that, and I think that for now, uh, different actors are keeping up the fiction of a united Yemen, because it's in most actors' interest, and by actors I mean domestic Yemeni actors, but also regional and international powers to maintain what is a fiction, right, of a united Yemen. Um, for now, I think that maintaining that fiction is sustainable. But as I was saying, for the US, for the UAE, for Saudi Arabia, but also for domestic players in Yemen, including the STC, as the internationally recognized government risks becoming squeezed, at some point that fiction is not sustainable. I don't think we're at that point now. I think it remains in most actors' interest to maintain that fiction for at least the short term. And frankly, I absolutely don't have any kind of crystal ball that could tell us how long that fiction can be sustainable. But at some point, the STC will have to make the calculus that the costs of itself playing along with that fiction outweigh the benefits. And I think part of the reason why that cost-benefit calculus will shift will be the weakening of the internationally recognized government. And I struggle to see that trend changing in the future. Maybe I'm wrong, but for now, as long as the internationally recognized government is on a slow downward trend, at some point, that will become a new calculus for the STC for sure.
Right, right. Adrian, quick question to you. For years under Ali Abdullah Saleh, we saw that debate about the GCC needing to incorporate Yemen, right, to bring it into the GCC structure. And then there was this friendship signed, and there were all these plans about economic cooperation, etc. Today, the way we see politics developing in a de facto two-state scenario, do you foresee either the STC presenting a plan that allows the South to be incorporated more into the GCC structure, or do you see the GCC aiming to bring Yemen more into the fold? And I'm talking back to the economics, right? The primary economic partner for Yemen, for southern Yemen, whether it's agriculture, what have you, would be logically the GCC, especially in the agriculture sector. This has been pushed for years. Do you foresee any potential there as a solution to the economic crisis while the country is basically divided?
I mean, that would be a very interesting solution to the economic crisis. But then again, are you going to get the GCC countries now, not Salah age, now are they going to play along with the STC, which some will view as a separatist group, and in some circles, separatists, they're not liked, they don't want it. It's very interesting that you look at the Presidential Leadership Council, and it comes from what is basically a hand-me-down from Saleh to Hadi, and then to it's been weak from the beginning. It's been propped up by the military. It never really had any type of vision for the country, and then it performed miserably on the battlefield. Okay, and so now we look at the STC. They are forming protective rings around Aden. All right. They're protecting against the Houthi front, the AQAP threats. They are maintaining a pocket of security. The question is, can you grow that area? And obviously, one way to grow is through economic investments. Now, can you get the STC to split away and then form an agreement with, let's say, the Saudis, UAE as their own independent de facto state? I can't see that happening. I think that's going to rock the boat way too much, and that's not what people in the region really want. Now, this could very well change 4 years down the road. We really don't know what's going to happen. As far as that, we can see where the pendulum is kind of swinging, and it's swinging in the direction that I don't want to see. But there is still room for, I think, economic advancement. But again, as I've said over and over, before we got into the civil war, before we got into this Arab Spring, before we got into all this mess, Yemen was always in the rearview mirror. People didn't care about it. People didn't know about Yemen. And that's part of the problem.
Absolutely, absolutely. Ari, any closing comments from your end?
No, I think Adrian and Thomas covered it. I think, yeah, I think they did a great job of that.
Thank you. Once again, thank you to all three of you. Really appreciate your time, your insight. Always, thank you very much for answering my calls and joining our panels. Really appreciate it. Thanks again to Ayad, Yaqub, Farida, the entire South 24 team in Aden and elsewhere. for facilitating all of this. Hope our audience everywhere appreciated today's panel and their insight. Hopefully you'll join us at the next one. We had one a few weeks ago with Fair Observer, which was excellent. And now in June, ACSYS, the American Center, we will organize a similar panel, the part 2 of this panel with a Yemeni expert. So to give you more of a direct a Yemeni, a local insight, so our audiences can see how we outsiders perceive what's going on in country versus how Yemenis really are taking all of these developments and how they see the conflict and prospects for the future. Thank you very much to everyone. Have a great day. See you soon. Thank you.